My name is Stacey Links, and I'm a research fellow at the LeidenAsiaCentre at Leiden University, and I'm a South African scholar, and my specialization is in critical international relations and specifically China-Africa relations. My research within the project is focused on Africa as a region. So we have two researchers focused on the African region, and I specifically look at regional bodies within Africa and how they relate to the BRI and China more broadly speaking. This regional body is SADC, the Southern African Development Community, and little is known actually about SADC and China relations, and specifically SADC's relationship in terms of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. So I'm investigating SADC's role as a regional body vis-a-vis China's increasing power in Africa. So I conducted my field research in Gaborone, Botswana at the SADC headquarters, SADC being the Southern African Development Community, and I conducted these interviews with high-level officials and experts in the field. I also conducted interviews in Johannesburg, South Africa, at the Southern African Institute for International Affairs, and that was a range of expert interviews with researchers working on the intersections of China-Africa relations. So when it comes to the question of to what extent we can attribute agency to local actors, I think when we speak of agency, we really need to understand that all actors actually have agency. And the more interesting question is actually how this agency is exercised. So the dominant assumption oftentimes is that African actors have very little agency in their relationship with China, when in fact the more pressing question is how is their agency actually exercised vis-a-vis a power like China. I think the context really matters when we look at the issue of agency, and how that agency actually comes out or how it is performed is extremely important for us to understand as academics, because that has an impact essentially on policy between China-Africa relations, and especially considering the Belt and Road Initiative. So when we look at a regional body like SADC and we try and analyze the issue of agency, what we see is that agency is very much connected to this idea of agenda setting. But agenda setting is not the only component of agency that's interesting to look at. What's also interesting to look at is how agenda setting can be actualized, or how it actually comes to fruition. And that's a very important aspect of trying to understand agency and how it is exercised. The other important component is that agency is obviously, or in some cases, very much constrained by structural aspects. So as much as we want to look at agency, we have to have recognition for the fact that there are certain structural constraints that in essence constrain actors in their ability to exercise this agency. So China-Africa relations have had a big impact, I think, on international relations broadly speaking. Although China has engaged in Africa in quite an economic sense, this has had geopolitical consequences. What we see is that Africa, as a chronically underdeveloped region, is now embarking on a path, and one could argue, because of China, embarking on a path of development. Now, this development affects global value chain. So in an economic sense, China has really helped Africa on this kind of path to development, some would argue. But these economic shifts obviously have implications geopolitically in terms of, as far as Africa is developing and China is developing, these two areas, one could argue, are actually gaining a kind of seat at the international table. And so politically speaking, what we see is almost a democratization of the international space, where you have players from the global south having an increasing say and actually having an increasing impact on the traditional powers of North America or Europe, so to speak. So this has provided a confrontational, some would argue, a political situation internationally where traditional powers have really had to reflect on what these shifts, both economic and political shifts, mean for their traditional place in international society. Most of the research till this point has assumed that Africa exercises very little agency vis-a-vis their relationship with China and the Belt and Road Initiative specifically. However, what's come about is that agency is actually exercised, perhaps not in the way that we conceive of it. However, African regional bodies such as SADC do have agendas and are very much focused on ensuring that these agendas are fulfilled.